Welcome to The Explainer, where we break down big ideas.
Have you ever really stopped to think about the medicine you take? It's not just one pill, right? It's millions, sometimes billions that get made every single year. And the crazy part is, every single one of them has to be absolutely perfect. The dose has to be right, it has to be safe, and it has to work every time. So how on earth do you pull that off on such a massive, massive scale?
I mean, the challenge is just staggering. We're talking about manufacturing lines that have to produce millions of perfectly identical copies. There is absolutely zero room for error, because even a tiny mistake, when you multiply it by a million, can have truly devastating consequences. And for a long, long time, the industry's way of dealing with this was, well, it was a bit like just crossing your fingers and hoping for the best.
And that really brings us to two completely different philosophies. For decades, the old way was something called quality by inspection. You'd make a gigantic batch of pills, then you'd pull a few out at the very end, test them, and just hope the entire batch was okay. It was totally reactive. But today, there's a revolutionary new way of thinking, quality by design. And here, instead of just hoping for quality, you actually engineer it into the product from the very beginning.
This new philosophy is really the answer to our big question. It's called quality by design, or QBD for short. And you have to understand, this is a complete shift in thinking that has totally transformed how modern medicines are developed and made.
So what does engineering quality actually mean in practice? Well, the official definition gives us some huge clues. A few words just jump right out: systematic, predefined objectives, and sound science. This isn't about guesswork or getting lucky. It's about deeply understanding every single variable, from the raw ingredients to the settings on a machine, so you can control the final result with incredible precision.
You know, the core mantra of QBD is really simple. Begin with the end in mind. It's like this. Imagine you want to bake the world's most perfect cake. You wouldn't just start throwing flour and sugar in a bowl, right? No, you'd have this crystal clear picture of that cake in your head. How it should taste, its texture, how tall it should be. Well, that's exactly what scientists do with QBD. They define what the perfect pill looks like first, and then they work backward to figure out exactly how to make it.
And look, this isn't just some vague, fuzzy idea. QBD is a very structured four-step process. First, you define your target. Second, you design the product's recipe. Third, you design the manufacturing process itself. And finally, step 4, you build a control system to make sure it all runs perfectly. So, let's walk through these 4 pillars using a real-world example to see how it all clicks together.
All right, so let's dive into step 1, defining the target. For our case study, we're going to follow the development of a generic drug called Acetriptan. For the scientists creating it, the very first job was to define exactly what their pill had to do to be just as good as the original brand-name drug.
To do this, they create a critical document called the Quality Target Product Profile, or QTTP. You should really think of it as the master blueprint for the pill. For Acetriptan, this blueprint specified everything. It had to be a 20 milligram immediate-release tablet. It needed a shelf life of at least 2 years, and, this is the big one, it had to dissolve fast enough to be bioequivalent, which is just a sciencey way of saying it has to work in your body the exact same way as the original. This document right here is their perfect cake.
So with the target perfectly defined, it's time to move on to step 2, designing the recipe, or what scientists call the formulation. This is where they mix the active drug with other ingredients to create the pill itself. But with Acetriptan, they immediately hit a major scientific snag.
Here was the challenge. Acetriptan is what's known as a BCS Class II drug. Now, you don't need to remember the name, but what you do need to know is that it means the drug doesn't dissolve well in water, at all. It's kind of like trying to stir sand into a glass of water. And that is a huge, huge problem when your target says 80% of the drug has to dissolve in just 30 minutes.
The scientists knew one potential solution: play with the particle size. If you grind the drug into a superfine powder, like flour instead of coarse sugar, it has way more surface area and dissolves much, much faster. And the data here shows it works. The small particles easily pass the dissolution target while the larger ones fail. So, easy fix, right? Well, not quite.
Because, and this is crucial, there's a trade-off. That same fine powder that dissolves so well is also really sticky and doesn't flow smoothly. It just clumps together, which makes it incredibly difficult to get a uniform mix. This chart shows that problem as something called %RSD. Just think of it as a wobble factor for the dose, and you want that number to be as low as possible. As you can see, the small particles create way too much wobble, meaning some pills could end up with too much drug and others with too little. A complete non-starter.
So you can see the puzzle they were facing. They were stuck. They needed small particles for the pill to dissolve, but they needed larger particles to get a uniform mixture. So the question becomes, how do you find that perfect balance? How do you hit both of these critical targets at the exact same time?
The answer is where the real power of QBD comes in. Using a technique called design of experiments, they could test a ton of different combinations all at once. They didn't just vary the particle size. They also changed the amount of another ingredient, called a disintegrant, which helps the tablet break apart. And by mapping all those results, they found it, the green zone. That perfect sweet spot, what they call the design space, where a medium particle size combined with a high level of disintegrant let them hit all their targets. Just like that, they had found their perfect recipe.
So, the recipe is locked in. Now we're on to step 3, designing the manufacturing process. Because, having the right ingredients is one thing. Figuring out how to combine them perfectly on a massive scale, that's a whole other challenge.
Because that powder mix flowed so poorly and because the drug itself was sensitive to heat, they couldn't just use standard methods. They had to pick a very specific process called roller compaction. It basically squishes the powder between two giant rollers, which forms these dense ribbons of material. This simple action breaks up the clumps and makes the whole mixture flow like a dream as it moves into the tablet press. Now, through their scientific studies, they uncovered this really clear cause and effect relationship. They found that a critical process parameter, in this case the pressure from the rollers, directly controlled a key quality of the material, the density of that ribbon. More pressure meant a denser ribbon. Simple enough?
But this discovery led them to a second, much less obvious connection. It turns out the denser they made the ribbon in that first step, the softer the final tablet became. Now, I know that sounds totally counterintuitive, but it actually makes sense when you think about it. If you squeeze the powder that hard at the beginning, it sort of loses some of its ability to be squeezed again later on. It's lost some of its compressibility.
And this, right here, is the real superpower of QBD, deep process understanding. They could now predict, and more importantly, control the final pill's hardness just by managing the roller pressure at one of the earliest steps in the process. They weren't just reacting anymore. They were basically conducting an orchestra.
So all of this amazing knowledge, from the recipe to the process, leads us to the final step, putting it all together into one comprehensive control strategy. This is the master plan that ensures every single batch is perfect, every time. And this strategy is built in layers. They control the input materials, specifying the drug particle size has to be between 14 and 30 microns. They control the process parameters, like setting that roller pressure to hit a very specific ribbon density. They use in-process checks, like real-time sensors, to make sure the powder is mixed perfectly. And then, of course, they still do final testing at the end to confirm the finished pill meets every single target from that original blueprint, the QTPP.
So, when you step back, you see that QBD completely reframes what quality assurance is. It's no longer this one-time inspection at the end of the line. Instead, it becomes this continuous, intelligent process of monitoring and control that is scientifically designed into the system from the absolute very beginning. It's not about doing more testing. It's all about using smarter science. This fundamental shift from simply inspecting quality to proactively designing it, it ensures we get millions of perfect pills, sure, but it also opens up some absolutely fascinating new possibilities. And that leaves us with a final, thought-provoking question. If drug quality can be designed from the ground up, what does that unlock for the future of medicine?